I'm extremely happy to be here with all of you. I've been traveling in India for about a month now. This is not my first visit here. This is the second time I've come on a long tour, but for the last 30-some years I've been coming in and out of the country for one reason or another, in one way or another. And as Jaya was explaining, really all of my adult life, since the age of 22, has been dedicated to the path of self-realization as Master Yogananda taught it, and especially as Swami Kriyananda imparted it to me and to many others. The context of the spiritual life that I've had has always been in the context of the community of Ananda, communities of Ananda, starting with the first one that Swami Kriyananda founded in California. He started it in 1968. I met him in 1969. It took me about 18 months to take up residence, but ever since then, I have always lived in community, except for a brief period when we moved from Ananda Village in the mountains in California down to Silicon Valley, when we didn't have one and had to start one. But even then, the spiritual life that we were living in Ananda has always been deeply involved with people. It's not been a path in which we sort of take the teachings and hold it in our heart and go off into a desert or a cave or some isolated place, and then the only question is ourself and our meditation and our relationship to the infinite. Always it's been a question not only of seeing God within ourselves, but also seeing the divine in one another and behaving appropriately, given that fact. There's a sweet story that's told about Master and one of his disciples, and the disciple felt Master's divine reality so deeply that he wrote Master a note that said, "Whenever I see you, I see only Divine Mother." And the next time Master met him, he said he had a cane, and he kind of tapped the disciple on the leg, and he said, "Then behave accordingly." Which he didn't, he wanted him to understand that that perception is accurate, but it's not enough merely to have that kind of devotion. We have to then mold our lives around that fact. Sister Gyanamata was the most advanced woman disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. I want to take this down just a little. And can you still hear me accurately if I stand back? Okay, it was just a little too much in my face. She was the most advanced woman disciple, and her simple comment about spiritual life was this: "Your realization is tested," she said, "in the cold light of day." And I don't think there's any colder light of day than our interactions with other people. I mean, that is really when who we are, not merely as an idea that we can imagine or affirm, but really face to face, how do we respond? There's a wonderful spiritual book. It's called The Hiding Place. If you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to read it. It's the story, it's written by Corrie ten Boom is her name. She's a Dutch woman, a deeply devoted Christian. She's passed from the planet now, but she and her sister Betsy and her father were living in Amsterdam at the time when Hitler invaded the country. And they became devoted to trying to save the lives of Jews. And their little house became a center of the underground, and they often had 10 or 12 Jewish people living with them, hiding them there. In the end, they were betrayed, although they managed to save everyone that they were protecting. But Corrie, her father, and her sister all went to the concentration camps where Betsy and her father died. Only Corrie survived. The whole point of all of this is, in the middle, before they were captured, they built a secret room. That's the hiding place. And they practiced all the time this drill, which is, what if the Gestapo came knocking on the door and demanded that they turn over the Jews that they were hiding. And so they had to practice and practice this drill where in a matter of 30 seconds or a minute, every trace of these 12 or 15 additional people in their house could all be moved into the hiding place, and all the people with it, so that when the Gestapo came through, they would find no one but Betsy, Corrie, and her father. Now, often the Gestapo naturally would raid in the middle of the night when people were sleeping and so on. So they had to practice in the middle of the night. And Corrie explained that she had a very difficult time coming out of sleep. And so her young nephew would train, they would do these drills just in the middle of the night, banging on the door, all this chaos. And then her nephew would rush to her where she was sleeping in bed, shine the flashlight in her eyes, and say, "Where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?" Invariably, Corrie would say, "Behind the wall in the room right here." And it was right next to her bed. She would just say, they're here, like this. And she said she had to work extremely hard to come out of deep sleep and still remember the higher truth in that moment, which is Jews, what Jews? My sister, my father, what are you talking about? Now, there's a thousand reasons why that book and the story are deeply inspiring, but that's not the point of this lecture. The point that I've always taken from that is that all through life, we are walking along, we appear to be awake, we're talking to each other, we can sip tea, we can read books, but we're spiritually sort of half awake and half asleep. And then things happen to us. And it's just like being shined, the flashlight is shone in our eyes, and in a split second, we have to decide, who am I? What is the truth? What reality am I serving? How can I move into a higher realm? And how we react, the difficult problem of spiritual life is very simple, that we are inside our own reality. We are on this side of our own faces. I'm always, whenever I've seen my face, almost my whole life, it has never looked right to me. Almost every time I look at it, it's like, oh yeah, that's probably me. I finally honestly realized when I started coming to India, when I see the women with the black eyes and the dark skin and the long black hair, and it's like, that's what it's supposed to look like. You know, somehow I got this one, and I am so confused by it even still. I mean, I think all of us are, because we have many incarnations. A dear friend of mine, Bella, she was a Russian woman who lived at Ananda village. She died relatively young of cancer. It ran in her family. And on the very last days of her life, when she had to leave her husband and her family, but she had moved way out from little human attachment, and one of her friends was talking with her, and she said, lying here, and this was really the last day or two of her life, she said, "I see thousands of faces passing before me, and I realized that every one of them was one of my incarnations." So she said, in that thinking like that, she says it's very hard to cling to the little bits that belong to this one. You know, a great possibility for all of us to pass from this world with such an understanding. But most of the time, we are deeply defined by the little context in which we live, and being so close to it, it's very difficult to get an objective perspective on who we are and what we're really doing. I'm so charmed by the fact. I used to be deeply annoyed by this same fact, but now I'm charmed by it, which I suggest is a very positive progression, that everybody seems so reasonable to himself or to herself, that the way we behave just seems so natural. Even though from the outside, we can think of 100 or 1,000 better ways for that person to be, obviously, if they could think of them, they would be that way, wouldn't they? But whatever they're doing is consistent with the karmic pattern they themselves have set. I learned this profoundly when my parents were in the last years of their lives. My parents were very honorable people. They were always very good to me and very supportive. They did not have any particular interest or capacity to embrace the path of self-realization. So it wasn't as if I could share really deeply with them what my life was about, but we were united in the heart nonetheless. But when my parents began to reach the last years, my mother was ill with Parkinson's, which if any of you have familiarity with it, it's a big challenge. Toward the end of his life, my father's mental state began to shift. But when all of that began to set into place, out of a sincere desire to help them, but what I gradually realized was misguided, the way they wanted to handle the situation in their life was not the way I wanted it to be handled. And I spent a lot of time trying to make them do it my way. And finally, I grasped the fact that this was their karma. I mean, that may seem obvious, and that where they were standing, as it happened at the end of their life in their 80s, that they had worked themselves to that position step by step, inch by inch, by every single decision they had made this entire incarnation. And it wasn't a terrible place that they were. It was just very different than where the trajectory of my life leads me. And I suddenly realized that I was trying to pull them from where they rightfully belonged into something that I was more comfortable with. And it crossed my mind finally, whose good am I serving here? It looked really good. I was going to make them more comfortable in the way I thought they should be. I was going to make them more secure in the way I thought they should be. I was going to get them the medical care the way I thought they should have it. And it wasn't that I was wrong. It just never took into account what it looked like and felt like to be inside of their reality. And after a bunch of running around in circles, accomplishing nothing, I was both exhausted and confused. And I finally stood back and remembered something I had known, but I learned it more vividly. I asked myself, not where do I think they should be going, but where are their souls trying to take them? You know, the only way on the spiritual path that we can understand relationships is we have to pick it up by the highest string. And the highest string is not, oh, let's all be happy together. You do what I want you to do, and then I'll do what you want me to do, and then nothing will ever disturb the little world that we set up for ourselves. Master had a phrase for this. He called it us four and no more. No more of God, no more of self-realization. We just set up our little world and we all cooperate to keep ourselves exactly where we are. Right? Nobody grows, nobody rocks the boat, nobody expands. But once we have, with any part of our understanding, the realization that one incarnation is just like a few pages in a very long book. Apparently, Master said Master put this idea in once to just help us to understand. If somebody made a movie of your whole life experience, it would probably be 90 minutes. Haridas was fond of saying when he was facing a really tough situation, he would think, in the movie, maybe this will be a scene or two. And therefore, like, what's the big deal? Think how fast a scene goes by on the screen. To us, it feels enormous, but this is a long story. And the passage from lifetime to lifetime does not really erase the past. It doesn't erase the karma. The karma is stored in the chakras, and we just continue in exactly the same flow. Swamiji was fond of saying on more than one occasion, when we shed the body, for all practical purposes, nothing happens. I mean, we feel like something really amazing has happened when we watch it from this side. But Swamiji said when we ourselves are the one making the transition, he said nothing happens. We are still connected to the magnetism and the stored karma in our chakras, and the consciousness that we have, the form changes slightly. We lose the physical body, we live in the astral body, we don't have the same context, but it would be just like if after here we go into a restaurant to have lunch and then go home again. The context changes slightly, but our essential consciousness stays the same. And the only way to change that essential consciousness is not by the mere passage of time, but by our response, moment by moment, to the situations that we're in. And all of us have a really simple choice. We can act in such a way that our consciousness expands, and in that expansion we are able to embrace more of our infinite bliss nature, or we can respond to life in such a way that our consciousness contracts, and that we then limit our capacity to experience and to receive that bliss nature. And the whole spiritual path, it's very interesting. Sometimes we can get down to very small formulas. And this is one of those formulas. You see, we are deeply identified with this physical body, with this body, which is also the astral and even the causal body. Yogananda described ego as the infinite spirit identified with this one body. It's a brilliant definition. We have not really become this body, but we have now defined ourselves by it. And when you start thinking about all of the different sort of points of tension, either inner anxiety or anxieties with other people, it all starts from that essential identification. Because I am of this gender, of this culture, I am your husband or your daughter, you are my mother, you are my father. Think about all those relationships are dependent upon defining ourselves as this one body. If we defined ourselves like Master did, Master was walking with Swamiji one evening toward the end of his life, toward the end of Master's life, and he was holding on to Swamiji's arm, and he stumbled a little bit, and Swamiji had to support him. And Master just looked at Swamiji and blissfully declared, I am in so many bodies, he said, sometimes I forget which one I'm supposed to keep moving. And then he said, I have to ask others whether or not I've eaten. I mean, isn't that marvelous to contemplate? Do any of you not know whether you had breakfast? You know? It's like we are committed to this form that we live in, and everything about it we think is the guiding principle of who we are. Now, you can immediately see that that limited identification is the beginning both of all our relationships, and also is the point at which tension begins. I lived with Swami Kriyananda. I mean, I was in close association with Swami Kriyananda for more than 40 years. There's many simple ways to define his greatness as a spiritual person, so I will randomly choose a few to talk about it here. Swamiji could always see it from our point of view. He never imagined that we were him in the wrong sense of the word. He could understand things from a certain point of view, but he could always also see it from our point of view. And he had a marvelous phrase. Once I was spearheading a project that he himself had given me, but that was very controversial within the Ananda community. And he never guided us by the power of his authority. You know, I told her to do it and therefore she should do it. He liked all of us to be able to perceive truth independently of just blind obedience. So I was moving forward with this project because I also believed in it. Many other people did not. And so Swamiji was getting phone calls. He was very accessible, and many different people were calling, expressing great alarm about what was going to happen, and just completely contradictory points of view. And Swami had this wonderful response, and the response was, I understand why you feel that way. Isn't that perfect? He didn't say, I agree or I disagree. He didn't offer any other words. He just said, I understand why you feel that way. And he did. Swamiji tells the story about Master, about a guest who came to Los Angeles. And he was an Indian man. And first Swamiji described how presumptuous the man was and how he imposed on Yogananda's hospitality for months at a time and complained of the conditions, and Master was always gracious to him. But the final point was when this man wanted to give a dance performance, claiming to be a really good dancer. Swamiji said that he thinks the only dancing he actually did was dancing around a boxing ring. But nonetheless, he fancied himself to be an artist. And so he got musicians and they put on this performance. And among other things, the performance went on forever. It was a hunter stalking a deer, and he played the hunter, then he played the deer, and then he killed the deer, and then the deer writhed in agony, and then the hunter triumphantly marched around with the dead deer on his shoulders, and it just went on and on. And Swamiji said he was sitting next to Master, and Master was just so amused by the foolishness of the whole performance that they were just having to suppress laughter. He said tears were actually coming out of their eyes because they were inwardly laughing so much. And Swamiji described that just a little bit of a chuckle began to come out of his mouth because he couldn't suppress it. And Master said to him, you know, out of the corner of his mouth, don't give in. Because once they started laughing, they would never have been able to stop. So Master was completely aware of how foolish, in a sense, this man was. And finally, actually, one of the musicians had them bring the curtain down. That's the only way the performance ended. Afterwards, the Indian guest came up to Master and complained that it was so difficult to perform because the musicians were not professional like he was, and they weren't keeping the right rhythm, and he was doing his best, but circumstances were really against him. And Master said, I understand. And what Swamiji was saying, he did. He was as much inside that man's consciousness, feeling his aspiration to be, loved, accepted, recognized for his talent, allowed to express himself. Master didn't say, oh yes, you're a great artist and the musicians were terrible, because that would have been dishonest. He answered him with complete truth, but the truth was one that reached out in support and comfort. I've observed over many years of the spiritual life, both with other people and myself, that it's very rare for us not to know which way is forward and what we really ought to do in our lives. It's very rare that we don't know, but it's very common to be afraid to do it. I remember with my husband once, early on in our marriage, I was having to arrange a lecture tour. I was very hesitant in those days to commit myself, especially to commit myself in the future. My philosophy of life was there might be something more fun to do, and I don't want to have to promise to do that. What if I don't want to when the time comes? Not a real mature philosophy, but nonetheless, that's what I had. So to say I would be in Portland, Oregon on the 12th of April, in Seattle on the 30th, I had a really hard time making that decision. But of course, when you're arranging a long trip, everything depends on everything else, and you've got to do it in a timely manner. My husband is the kind of manager who picks up a piece of paper or reads an email these days and will deal with it in the moment. There's no gap. He just feels if it has to be done, do it now. So he looked at me and he saw the impending chaos if I did not make these decisions. And so he tried to help me by explaining to me all the terrible things that would happen if I didn't, get my act together and pull this tour together. The more he told me, the more my eyes got wide, the more paralyzed I became, the more utterly incapable I would be of making any of those decisions. Fear was not a good way to motivate me. Fortunately, I have some presence of mind, and I said, "Don't frighten me, comfort me," like this. And I said, "Tell me it's all going to be okay." So he started instead just comforting me, telling me it was all going to be okay. Fortunately for our marriage, he learned that lesson really well. But I also learned something very profound that's very important. I knew what to do. I was afraid to do it. And what was required is those who loved me and wanted to help me needed to create an atmosphere in which I felt loved. I didn't have to be told that I was right when I was wrong. We're not making an agreement to support each other in our delusions. I mean, in the sense that, just go ahead and make a mess out of the work you're doing, or go ahead and treat everybody terribly, that's just fine. But he was able to get inside my reality and to move me forward in the way I could be moved forward. That was, again, Swami Kriyananda's, because he could see it from our point of view. I understand why you feel that way. Then, understanding why we feel that way, he would intuitively know what we were capable of doing and what step we could actually take. And if possible, he asked a little more of us than was easy. But whatever he asked of us was consistent with our own reality. Now, his ability to be like this was based on the other part of healing relationships, which is our own consciousness. You see, Swamiji was completely content within himself. He was the truest friend to tens of thousands of people around the world. The number of people who considered Swami Kriyananda their best friend really staggers the imagination. But it was the truth. In fact, one young man who had just met him, who was visiting our retreat many years ago, he was there for the first time. He was meeting Swami Kriyananda for the first time. Things were much smaller then, and it was very accessible. Everyone was very accessible, including Swami. The man said to him, "I have just met you, but I feel more love from you than I feel from my own family." He said, "You don't even know me. How is that possible?" It's a very profound question, really. And Swamiji conceded, and I don't even think he knew the man's name. He said, "You're right. I don't know you, the details of your life, the way your own family does." He said, Swamiji said, "But I love God. And when I look at you, I see shining through your eyes that same divinity that I already love." And so the full devotion that Swamiji gave to God and gurus, there it was sitting in front of him, and there was no restraint. Of course, he wasn't loving, he didn't even know the personality. He was loving the divine possibility in that person. Now, when I'm talking about creating an atmosphere that gives us the courage to step out of our safe little identifications, we might as well think of it at the final end point. We tend to love each other because you're attractive, you're nice to me, you love me, we're the same community, we're the same ethnicity, whatever it might be. We have all these defined conditions that are all based on the ego definition of the whole, of the one body. But you see, those definitions by themselves, even inside ourselves, we know that's not really who I am. I was joking at the beginning of the problem of this face, which I've been wearing for 66 years. The problem of this face is that I don't remember it as clearly as I seem to remember other faces. And then there's so many little details about us, but part of us, you see, always knows, this is not really who I am. You know, I am the infinite spirit. I am free. And we have all these fears associated because we know that we're small. And when someone like Swamiji, this is the power of a saint to transform us. When they look at us, they remind us of who we really are. And it also is a sadhana the other way, which is to be able to release ourselves sufficiently from this tiny identification and the worldview that comes with it, and have both the imagination and the generosity of heart to give to other people the same freedom to be themselves and opportunity to go forward that we ourselves desire. Now, this is not easy. It's just as simple as that. But I have spent years of my life counseling people, and many times I've had many sessions of couples who are married or thinking of marriage, and they're trying to sort out all the details, and sometimes I don't even know where to begin. And I'm very grateful that the last book that Swami Kriyananda wrote, I'm going to just sort of go back for a moment. Not only did Swamiji make the spiritual life through community, which put all of the serious devotees in relationship to marriage, in relationship to earning money, in relationship to neighborhoods, in relationship to children. And if self-realization is the goal of life, and if I and all of us are individually committed to that, then how do we go about doing all these other things? But Swamiji himself also was a great lover of people. And he was deeply devoted. He only incarnated to help us. He had this deep devotion. And he used to contemplate the nature of human love a great deal. He would talk about it sometimes, but he was always trying to understand what the purpose of our relationships and our attraction was. And at the very last of his life, he wrote a book called Love, Perfected Life Divine. And he actually, because he never stopped being original to the last breath, he took a novel that was written 100 years ago, a very romantic novel written by an author called Marie Corelli, and the subject was soulmates in the most romantic way that people would describe those. She was imaginative but not wise. And so Swamiji took her essential plot but rewrote it with wisdom. And the story of that is based on this man and this woman who meet each other over many incarnations, and all of the ways in which the potential of their selfless love for each other shatters on the rocks of their selfishness. Just time after time after time after time. But finally, and in the way the story is, first the man finally understands that his inability to be a channel of the kind of love he aspires to have has nothing to do with anyone but himself. And that the limitation is not her or him or them or anything. It's that when he starts trying to be a channel for that infinite love, all these different fears and self-concerns come in the middle of it. So in the course of this novel, he steps back completely from any attempt through incarnations to meet this person who is his soulmate, as the story is told, and simply elevates himself to the point where he can see reality from a perspective greater than his own ego. Then he finds her again, And now she has the challenge of transforming herself to be able to match his now elevated vibration. And then the book becomes the story of her effort to transform herself and all that she has to face. When Swamiji finished writing that book, I thanked him profusely and said, you know, now finally I feel we have a starting point for the conversation. We have a starting point for the conversation of how to bring into our lives that kind of perfect love, love perfected, that all of us know. Now I'm going to back up a step from the end point. And you might not think of Sri Yukteswar and the holy science as exactly a guide to relationships. And it really isn't, except in this one very small way that I'm going to quote. You know, blessed are the pure in heart, Jesus said, for they shall see God. In Patanjali it says, yoga is the neutralization of the vortices of chitta, of the feeling nature, that the agitation of the heart, the likes and dislikes of the heart, talking in just simple human terms or deep esoteric yogic terms, we are bound by the likes and dislikes of the heart. And all of our troubles in life are because I want it like this, I don't want it to be like that. I want you to behave in this way, I don't want you to behave in that way. I want life to give me this circumstance, I don't want it to give me that circumstance. When in fact, there is only one reality in all of creation, and that is divine. And when the likes and dislikes of the heart cease, then we perceive everything as the bliss that it's actually meant to be. This is what Sri Yukteswar explains in the Holy Science. And then he has a whole section about 5 stages of purifying the heart. The first stage is simply dark, and he calls that the Shudra stage. And there's no way that there's no motivation at that stage to become better. And the only way that when the heart is dark, it can be elevated is to be in the company of those of higher consciousness. It's just a simple statement. But the second stage is, he said, when the heart is, and he uses this word propelled, which I think is actually a marvelous word, propelled, because we all think of it. We're propelled toward doing something. We're not passive. We're not patiently waiting. We do not have the ability to be still. We are forced to move. And in the way that Sri Yukteswar describes this, he talks about moving from Shudra to Kshatriya. That's not the whole point, but the idea of Kshatriya is that we are a warrior. And what Sri Yukteswar describes in the second stage of purifying the heart is we are battling between the illusion, the ephemeral illusion, and the eternal. And we are caught right there. And that's basically where all of us are. We sense the eternal. We're aware enough to realize that bliss is our true nature. Somehow the veil has thinned enough that we know it. And at the same time, we are trapped in the habit of the likes and dislikes of the heart enough that we're always shifting between these two realities. We're pulled toward, I want it my way, and if you would just cooperate and do it my way, everything would be just fine. A friend of mine described his wife's attitude as my way now or my way later. I was amused also by a politician in the East. I think he was Iranian, in the Mideast, Iranian, and he was actually, this is true, this is a true anecdote at least. He was campaigning as a politician, and he favored a great expansion of women's rights, which was of course very controversial in the culture in which he lived. And a reporter said to him, well, I understand you're taking this public stance, but in your own home, certainly you're the authority, aren't you? Oh, yes. He said, I always have the last word where any issue with my wife is concerned. Anything you say, dear. So there we are. Now, what Sri Yukteswar says, though, at the stage of being propelled at this kshatriya stage, trying to discern between the eternal and the ephemeral, we need the experience of mutual love. And we are forced into relationships with each other, not merely out of restless desire or anything like that, but our heart itself recognizes that it doesn't have the capacity to see itself clearly. We're just simply too deeply involved, that we need to bring ourselves out into the cold light of day and see what the cold light of day does to us. The difficulty is so often when people actually give back to us the appropriate response to the magnetism we're putting out, we blame them. Why don't you behave differently? A friend of mine, a couple who had a very unfortunate marriage, had this experience where each of them had many interior causes to suffer. They had many confusions that existed within them that they simply carried into their relationship with each other. Then he would do something and she would suffer. And because it appeared sequential in time, she consistently believed that he had caused her suffering. And it was exactly true the other way. He had cause to suffer, she would do something, he would respond with pain, he would believe that she had caused the pain. Now, it's true that a lot of people who are close to us behave badly. We don't have to pretend that everybody else is a saint and they're all being perfectly guided by God and just everything they're doing is perfect. A woman friend of mine suffered a deep hurt from someone in her life, and that man's actions were less than honorable, less than ideal, let's put it that way. He was doing the best he could, and Swami understood why he felt that way, but nonetheless, it was unfortunate, his actions. In an attempt to make herself feel better and to forgive, which is a word we can talk about in a moment, she came to Swamiji with this big understanding. Everything he did was perfect. Swami said, no, it wasn't. He behaved very badly. You know, it's sort of like the opposite of what you expect. He said, don't comfort yourself by telling yourself a lie. He said, the only way to freedom is to see reality exactly as it is and then expand your consciousness around it so that it becomes only a wave on the ocean instead of the entire definition of your reality. There is, you know, I have, as I mentioned, I have done a great deal of marriage counseling over the years. I have rarely seen, although it has happened, I have rarely seen two people together who were mismatched. Sometimes it's true, their vibrations are so different from one another that there's really no hope. Almost always, they were bringing suffering to the situation and then believing that the other one was causing it. And yes, circumstances were making it worse because the mirror was constantly coming back. Now, what we have to think about in our relationships is this. Now, let's go back to our essential premise. You know, we're here to become instruments of Divine Mother. We're here to become self-realized. We might want to settle for less, but we will be propelled until that realization is there. We're here to emulate in our own lives the consciousness of the great ones. Swami Kriyananda is our most recent example in time. Many of you know him, all of you at least know a little of him, and his extraordinary wisdom and generosity in helping people. All of us in our own hearts, that's what we really want. We want to be useful. We want to be beneficial. It's very painful for us when we realize our good intentions have not really resulted in the good results that we wanted. We want to learn. And more than that, on a divine level, our way to self-realization is to serve one another. I mean, seva, selfless service, to help each other to progress spiritually is what we're here trying to do. So it isn't just a question of what we think is right. What we really have to think about is what will really help this person. And this is what Swamiji has worked so hard to train us. I have always had a quick tongue and a fairly agile mind, and I can analyze and see situations. I remember one of my friends said to me at one point, very helpful remark for which I am always grateful. I had just told her something I thought she needed to know, and she smiled at me and she said, "Oh, my dear friend," she said, "you describe my shortcomings more clearly than I want to know them." Just like that. And in another circumstance, I was trying to be helpful to a friend, and his confusion to me was just as transparent as glass, so I explained it to him. Accurately, I believe, I say, even at this late date, but the next day he went to Swami Kriyananda and fiercely complained about how inappropriate I was, and who did I think I was, and I didn't know him at all, and Swamiji is telling me about this man's complaint. I resigned at that point from being an acharya. I just handed in my resignation verbally at that point, and Swami refused to accept it. But he said, it's not just a question of what you can perceive. You must always take into account a person's readiness to hear it. Because what are we trying to accomplish? You know, think about it. Going back to myself and my husband, I didn't need to be told the terrible danger I was in. I was constantly aware of it, and it was paralyzing me. I needed to be comforted, to be told that it would all be okay. Of course, then after that, we try to figure out, in that particular case, how to set up my tour, because it had to be done. But it starts from a point of, I understand the way you feel. And another way that Swamiji put it to me, he said, you have to gauge the maturity of the person that you're speaking to. He said, only a very mature soul can really just hear the unvarnished truth. Almost everyone needs to just be given a little bit of it. I watched Swami Kriyananda so many times. And one particular incident, actually, as it happened, it was the same person just by chance. Swamiji said, well, so-and-so, he really needs to learn this lesson, and I really think that I need to tell him. And there was a certain amount of glee among others of us that finally, you know, this person was going to be straightened out. And Swami did speak to him, and spoke to him very firmly in a public setting in a loud voice because other people became uneasy when Swami was so strong, and they sort of were escalating the noise level, and Swami had to go above it. He did it exactly in a straight line from when he said it would, 10 years later. Because it just took 10 years before he felt there was fertile soil in which to drop that truth. Now, in the meantime, not everybody was having a pleasant experience. You know, everything wasn't just all in order. We were all just having to sort of wait and live and wait and live. But Swamiji himself, you see, he didn't need this man to be different. And his only desire was to help him. And so he just wasn't going to act out of his own restlessness or even other people's urging. This woman came to me once. I've been running this community with my husband for many years, and even among Gurubhais, people have personalities. And even more, as Swamiji said, we're a very old spiritual family. And we have had lots of different experiences, and not all of them are positive. You know, we are friends, and we are also ancient enemies. Swamiji talked when he was with Master about how two of the monks were there, and they just suddenly hated each other. And they asked Master why. He said, oh, in a past life you were enemies. And so now you are, and what you remember is all the things that you did against each other. But that's all behind you. But nonetheless, also people have personalities. Some people are soft and always gentle about what they do. Others are warriors and always being firm about what they want. And these forces clash. And in our community, as in all communities, there was a person who was, harder to move with than some might be. And somebody came to me with this force. You have to do something about this person. I said, well, they're dedicated to the spiritual path. They're doing the best they can. I have an idea. We have this green in the green area in the center of our community. I said, let's take this guy out into the green and let's shoot him. That would solve it. Let's just execute him. Then none of us will have to deal with him anymore. And naturally, she looked horrified. But I said back, what do you want here? That we could make his karma something that it isn't? And then, of course, I didn't tell her how many people complained about her, because I didn't think that would be helpful. And I have learned a little from the beginning. But we all have to put up with each other, because we are propelled to find out the likes and dislikes of our heart, to suffer the consequence of our narrow ego attachments, and we get the opportunity to find out where my suffering really comes from. And at this particular stage, we think it's because it happens sequentially, we think it's being caused by other people. But it's invariably being caused because I want it to be this way, and it's turning out to be this way. Now, there's one more piece of this that's extremely important, and it's the word appropriate. And it's a word that I put onto this situation because it's very important to understand this. Very often in relationships with people, we think the object is to be nice. And we imagine that just getting along with everybody is the way, that's what success looks like. And that if you make any waves at all, that somehow something is wrong. It's not at all true. The point of the spiritual life is to be free, is to neutralize all the likes and dislikes of the heart, and to be able to move through this world as a pure instrument of Divine Mother, always being able to respond to exactly what she wants. I had to learn at a certain point in my life to be able to deal with conflict, to be able to deal with people being upset. For a long time, I thought being nice was more important than being truthful or appropriate. And I learned to be able to deal with dissonant energy. In my family, we never argued. We debated, but we never fought. It just didn't happen. One of my girlfriends grew up in a house, as she described it, where every meal ended with one of the sisters getting up from the table, bursting in tears, and running out of the room and slamming the door of her bedroom. So she was real comfortable with that flow of energy. Many years later, we were working on a project at Ananda. We were actually publishing The Path. And I was in charge of seeing that project through, and she, the same woman who was a dear friend, had a key role in the design. It was very stressful. We were working many hours as we could to meet the deadline. And the building that we were in was 3 stories, and it was an open stairwell in the middle. And this feisty woman was just sort of building up a head of steam, getting more and more tense and agitated. And she was in the basement, and I was in the top floor. And somehow or another, she started in. Shouting was very comfortable part. This is all at Ananda. Shouting very comfortable. And I'm looking at her, and I perceive this woman needs to fight with somebody. She just needs to get up from the dinner table, stomp away, and slam her bedroom door. And I think, might as well be me. So she starts shouting something at me, and I shout back to her, and she shouts back to me. This is in the middle of the whole building. Everybody can hear. She's shouting at me, I'm shouting at her. She escalates, I match her. We both come up like this, and we sort of crescendo. And then there's almost this little moment of hee, hee, hee. Then the whole thing just comes down again. And afterwards, in a strange way, I was extremely proud of myself, because Divine Mother needed somebody who wasn't afraid to just give her what she needed in that moment. And I remembered again, the goal of the spiritual path is not to be nice, it's to be helpful, it's to be free of compulsion, so that we can hear the inner whisperings of spirit and respond. You may have heard the story in the life of Ramakrishna, 2 different disciples. They're coming over on the ferry from Calcutta, probably out to the temple where Ramakrishna lived, and somebody starts speaking very ill of Ramakrishna, and the devotee is just sitting there deciding, I'll just be peaceful, I won't say anything. And so he calmly just lets this man denigrate his guru in terrible terms. When he gets off of the boat, Ramakrishna is there to meet him, and says, and Ramakrishna is weeping, the terrible things that man said against me, and you said nothing to defend me. Who will defend me if those who love me don't defend me? Like this. Another story, another man is coming across on the boat, and Ramakrishna was controversial, and so someone sees the temple and starts saying bad things. This man begins to shout. He's powerful, so powerful, he begins to rock the boat. He threatens to sink the boat and drown them all if this man doesn't stop what he's saying. He gets to the temple. Ramakrishna is there. Ramakrishna says, oh, why bother with such fools? Let them say whatever they want, right? Because the point is freedom. The point is be able to feel what is right, what is helpful, what is appropriate, and to respond accordingly. Now, what is appropriate, and this is a point that's extremely important, we are all equal in the eyes of God. Master makes this point. Master said about himself, he said, God loves you just as much as he loves the greatest saint in the world. Krishna, Christ, Yogananda himself, God loves all of us equally. It's a very hard idea to grasp unless you lift your mind higher than we normally live. We are all one in the spirit. There is no discrimination about who's more worthy. We're all exactly the same in the eyes of God, which means that you are just as important as your wife, your mother, your children. Now, that doesn't mean your preferences, your conveniences, your prejudices are just as important, but it means your well-being is exactly equal. And another principle that we have to understand here is that it's righteous, that where there is dharma, where there is righteousness, everything always flows harmoniously. And so if one person inappropriately sacrifices their well-being, I'm not talking about their conveniences, their opinions, or their preferences. I mean their genuine well-being in the name of, oh, he's more important than me. That is not pleasing to God. We have to all live in truth. The parent who allows his child to think that anything he wants comes without any cost and is completely oblivious to what other people are doing, to make his life work, he doesn't grow up strong. He doesn't grow up with an appropriate understanding of how life really works. We don't really help him when we sacrifice truth. Just like my friend saying, everything that this person did was just perfect. No, Swami said, he behaved very badly. When people in your life behave badly, you're not helping them by pretending that wrong actions have no consequences. So there's a great deal of difference between a calm, appropriate response and acting from my likes and dislikes and needing you to be different so that all feel okay. You can always tell. You can always tell when someone is really trying to protect their own limitations by getting you to behave properly. Now, the problem is people will learn at their own pace. And this is where the principle, where there is dharma, meaning that action which expands consciousness. This is how we mean dharma in this sense. that action which expands consciousness, as long as we are acting according to that principle, the desired result, the uplifted result will always come. Where there is dharma, there is victory. This is an infallible principle of Ananda. And we use it cosmically to make community decisions, and we use it intimately to make decisions with each other. You know, if I do that which expands consciousness, then everything will come out in the end. The end, not necessarily today. Not necessarily even tomorrow. Because what we finally have to simply surrender is that everybody is on their own journey. Sometimes parents will have come to me and they're terribly concerned about their role with their children and so on. And, you know, being a parent is an enormously important God-given responsibility. No part of me is denigrating it. But if we think in terms of reincarnation, and even if you think about one lifetime, well, let's start with the thought of reincarnation. As Swamiji put it so powerfully, he said the man and the woman create a physical vehicle. That's how the woman's body works. She creates a physical body in which the soul can express its destiny. But the parents do not create either the soul or its destiny. They simply build the vehicle in which that soul can express its destiny. So from the moment that the soul is born, it's already on a journey. Master describes that at the moment of conception, when the sperm and the ovum unite, he says there is a flash of light in the astral world. And a soul ready to incarnate who is in tune with that light will come into those united cells, and then that's the power that creates the physical body. It's not created by the parents, it's created by the soul committing itself to follow the journey. But it's already in tune with that flash of light. It's already on a trajectory because it wasn't created in that moment. There was a little girl in our school. Swami Kriyananda came for a school performance. We have a school for children from 4 years old to 14. This little girl was about 8. And Swamiji was there. He was already elderly, although it was 10 years ago, so he was a little more spry than he was at the end. But he was already elderly. But his consciousness, as those of you know who have seen him, was always unrelated to his physical body. Just unrelated. And she was sensitive enough as a child to sort of get that this guy looked old but didn't seem old, and that he was sort of an adult, but maybe he was just the same age as her. She was just totally bewildered. And our children know about reincarnation and that aspect of life. And from a distance, she was a very strong-willed, thinking child. We saw her sort of like this, you know, and then she'd sort of turn over here and she'd look like this. Finally, she couldn't stand it. She just marched right up to him, put her face right next to him and said, "How old are you anyway?" Like this. Swamiji, reading her perfectly, just looked into her eyes and he said, "Well, let's put it this way. When you were an old woman, I was a little boy." And then it clicked in her mind and she just happily sailed off. She just got the whole picture. You know, so an old woman becomes a little baby, but the whole power, the trajectory of that life is right there. And so the parent, you know, you parent them for this long. I know in India families stay together longer, but nonetheless, the child becomes an adult and follows its own life and has its own trajectory, and here's the parental influence, and then you multiply that by millions of incarnations, and all the times that, you know, you were the child and they were the parent, and this child was your grandmother and you were the brother and you were enemies together and all of these other things. There's just this huge force of energy. And to imagine that we can say, be different. You see, that's what I was doing with my parents. Now that you're 80, I want you to live my life, not yours, which they considered to be a really bad idea. They did not want to live my life. They had never wanted to live my life. What made me think right now they would want to? Just because a child is born into your house you have a responsibility, but the real responsibility we have is to tune in to where each soul is trying to go. It has its own karma, its own destiny. I remember with my husband for a period of time when we were earlier in our marriage, we've done 3 decades together now, but early on, I just thought our life would be better if he were more like me. Don't you all agree? All the wives in the room? If he were just a little more like us, you know, a little less of a man and a lot more of a woman, everything would go nicer. If he would express his feelings, if he'd be more sensitive, if he would remember this, you know, if he would tell us what he's thinking. David would say to me, "You're always asking me what I'm thinking. I'm not thinking anything." That wasn't true, but that was how he wanted to respond to me. But I pushed him in ways that did not create harmony in the home. Let's just put it like that. And one day I remember I said to him, "Do you know what I want from you, in essence?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, why don't you go along with me?" He said, "Because I don't think it's a good idea." It's not who I was born to be. I mean, we can talk about men and women, but we're just 2 souls. It's not who I was born to be. It's who you were born to be. And I just started like looking at the whole thing really differently. How can I be a true friend? If you're a true friend, you help your friend go, assuming it's righteous. And if it's not a righteous, if you can't support it and can't stop it, sometimes you have to be a calm witness. A friend of mine once was contemplating a marriage that was a really bad idea. He asked me what I thought about it. I told him it would be a mitigated disaster, that it would end horribly, but he might learn something. And 3 years later, I mean, in America, you know, we have these experiences. It ended horribly, and he came to me and he said, "But I did learn something. There was nothing I could do." He asked me, I told him he wasn't going to change, but I just stayed his friend. I understand why you feel this way. So I began to think about my husband and everyone else in my life. How would they measure forward progress? What is their own next step? Where are you trying to go? And Swamiji gave us this marvelous construct for understanding this when he talks about superconsciousness, which of course is a cosmic phrase, but the way he would talk to us about our own superconsciousness. In English, we have to give these words meaning. In Sanskrit, there's very subtle words, but Swamiji has never made us learn the Sanskrit, so we just try to use English. But superconsciousness then means, it's like we live here at this level, but we expand into the infinite, in that connecting link between our ego identification and the true Satchidananda that we are. You could call it our own superconsciousness. It's the higher part of our own nature that we can access. And our lives are really being run from the superconscious much more than we realize, because the soul has its own destiny and it's following it. I asked Swamiji a question once because a friend of mine had this experience of me in a dream. And it seemed like a very real experience. And in the dream, I was talking to that person about something I really wanted to talk to them about, but hadn't found an opportunity. And I said, "Swamiji, what's happening with that?" And he gave me the most wonderful answer. He said, "The body sleeps, the brain sleeps, but superconsciousness doesn't need to sleep. It's not physical. Superconsciousness is always conscious. That's the nature of it. And so when the body and the brain go to sleep, the superconscious can just be scurrying about the universe doing everything that it would want to do." He said, if you want to help people in your waking state, you still want to help them even though you're asleep. And so if you can find a way, you find a way. Isn't that dear? But where this comes in is, I realized if I really want to help someone, and either my own desires and preferences are I can feel it, and you have to become just aware of this. I really want to tell them. if you feel this, not a divine calm sense that God wants me to tell them, but I really want to tell you what I think sort of feeling, be very careful. Be very, very careful. But if you want to help someone and don't know what to say, I have this thought, which is where you pray not only for the person, but you actually pray to the person. You pray to it in the sense of elevating your own consciousness, even if you're just sitting there having tea together. But take one part of your awareness and lift your consciousness as much as you are able, and address the higher reality of the person in front of you with a very simple, heartfelt question. How can I help you? Show me how to help you. I have found extraordinary, often totally unexpected positive results from that practice, because everybody knows what they ought to do. It's just a question of being afraid or uncertain about how to proceed. How can I help you move forward in your way to become who God wants you to be? I've sat there with a specific thought. I really want to say this to this person, but I have a slight uneasiness. I ask their superconsciousness, is this the right moment? And then things have happened literally, like as soon as I offer that prayer, the whole idea of what I was going to say vaporizes from my consciousness. And on more than one occasion, 2 weeks later, I'll remember, oh, I was about to say that. And it was like the superconscious of the other person said, not a chance, go away, boom, just gone. Or I've prayed that prayer and I've had a certain thought in my mind. The next second, the person asks me exactly what I would have wanted to say. Or a completely different thought will come into your mind, where the whole context will shift. Now, this requires self-control, detachment from our own fears. Oh, what if I don't do this, and my son does this, and my husband does that, and my wife does this, and my boss does this, like that. How wise can we be when that vibration is there? As soon as that vibration is there, whatever you say is going to be wrong, because even if it's perfectly right, the person will be able to feel that all you're thinking about is yourself and you're just trying to calm yourself down. How many times children are really, really good at this? We're trying to tell them what we know is in their best interest, and they know we're just trying to ease our own fears. And they usually have a way of getting around it, But if they understand that you understand, then it's entirely different. Well, I've gone a bit longer than I expected, but I would like to invite any questions or comments that you might have and see if we can go in that direction. Do we have any thoughts? We actually have a microphone, although the acoustics here are probably pretty good. Does anyone have any questions they might like to ask?
Says who would like to ask the second question.
Okay, who would like to ask the second question? Consider that the ice has been broken, and now there's another. Okay. Pomi in the back is willing. Yes?
Especially today.
Okay.
I see most of my friends so obsessed with that our child should compete, our child should do this, and our child should do that. How do you let go? Because, it's almost as if you're failing in your duty as a parent if you don't really push your kid.
I'm asked that a great deal in India. I honestly have it's very hard for me to answer that question, because there are so many wrong energies existing at the present moment for young people in the world. India is not the only country. Swami Kriyananda has started a whole new concept of education, education for life, in which we just simply raise and educate children differently. At the present time, especially here, and I'm very aware of the incredible complexities that manage our society, the society here right now, and the fact that the competition is unbelievable. I don't think children really excel when they're frightened. I don't think anybody excels when they're tense. We think that if we frighten people, they'll do better. But if you ask yourself in your own work situation, if you're scared all the time, does that bring the best out of you? So there is this just simple question about, there is a powerful hypnosis about what will enable these children to succeed, but it's not necessarily consistent even with what will help them to succeed. Then you have the other side of it, which is the parents' sincere concern that if certain standards are not met, then certain disasters will ensue. I am not able to even begin to dismantle that whole reality. So I would go to a very simple point. Build your relationship with God outside of your relationship with your children. Meditate deeply. Try to be conscious and intuitive in everything you do, because being detached and guided by the divine in relation to your children is the Olympic event of selfless love. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But the more deeply we have practiced connecting to those souls who are our children on a soul level, the more likely we are to be inspired and guided to give them the right advice and to respond to them properly. And there's another factor. In my relationship with my husband, my attachment has always been to my own ideas. It's a peculiar sort of attachment, but I have ideas about how things ought to be done, and I'm usually right. And often other people have other ideas, which are self-evidently inferior to mine. And bad things will happen if people don't do it my way. My emotional attachment to doing it my way, and this is not about our personal life, it's more about the work we do together, and my anxiety about it not going a certain way has been, it's not anymore, it has been really intense. And I was unable to stop it directly, but I always heard a certain sound in my voice, which is when I began to panic that it wasn't going to go my way. I would talk faster and faster, and I would talk higher and higher. Whenever I heard that tone of voice, I knew that no matter what I was saying, I was wrong. And I was not going to bring about the desired result, because once I was in that vibration, I was completely outside of divine center. So I began first to change my behavior by hearing that tone of voice. And at that point, I just stopped. Now, I haven't raised children, so I completely disqualify myself as an expert, but I have watched a lot of parents just fall again and again and again into a completely ineffective tone of voice, and you just watch your child just glaze over. There she goes again. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this really helpful? My desire is to help. Now again, I know the problem is more complex than what I'm saying, but for a fact, don't waste your energy. If what you're doing isn't working, then retreat a little bit and try to figure out what might. After that, good luck. We need a revolution. We need a massive revolution, and I hope for the sake of all the souls being born into this country, it comes soon. That's all I can say. Yeah. Yes. Here comes the microphone.
Being aged, very often I have to talk to the juniors. And I take the position as you expressed that I am that super conscious
Right.
and try to talk to them.
Right.
Many times I feel, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I doing right thing?
Mm-hmm.
This is a sort of a problem.
Right. Okay, I'll give you two answers to that about, okay. The first about talking to younger people, I'll tell you a story about Swami Kriyananda, what I learned from him. He was like 44, 43. I was 22 when we met. So naturally that age gap remained the whole time, especially through my 20s and 30s. I was very strong-minded. I never hesitated to express my opinion, and I was usually wrong. Perhaps not usually, but maybe half and half. Time passed, I had responsibility myself. Pretty soon I'm talking to people who are 22 to my 43, whatever it might have been. And I'm looking at someone, and there's a certain temptation to say, what do you know? You know, you have no experience. How can you be so determined? And a real desire to get my own way by just cutting off the conversation. Of course, I know that's not a good idea, but I also knew it was a good idea because I realized that in all the years I was with Swamiji, not one time did he refer to my age or lack of experience or his years or his experience. I mean, think how many times he could have said that. Even I knew Master and you didn't. He could have said anything, not once. So I developed this incredible sense of gratitude because he always allowed me to feel that I was worthwhile and could find my way. So I went to him and I said, I explained all this, and I said, Swamiji, I'm so grateful that you encouraged me in that way and gave me respect and never once mentioned my age. Well, he took my comment graciously, but he had this certain look in his eye that I recognized, which is like, this is not the end of the story. And after we had done that exchange, about the question of never mentioning my youth, he said, I never noticed. He said, I never notice how old people are physically, not even children. The soul is ageless, it's only the body that comes and goes. He says, I look into a person's eyes and I relate to the soul reality that I see there. This taught me a few things that are worth mentioning. The difference between behaving correctly and actually having right consciousness. And I saw that behaving correctly is better than behaving badly. But right consciousness is the goal. You see, the goal is not to be nice. The goal is to be free, is where we're going. Now, the other half of the question you asked, which is how to know whether you're doing the right thing or not, by making a whole lot of mistakes and paying attention to what it feels like when you're in tune and what it feels like when you're out of tune. And you really have to have the courage to try. And the other part of that is you have to practice all the time. Swamiji's way of putting it, you have to practice when it's easier, so that when there's a lot at stake, you will have some understanding of what it feels like to be in tune and what it feels like to be out of tune, what it feels like to be connected to another person's higher reality, and what it feels like to be what I call talking down a tube, just sort of talking down a tube to somebody who's long since absented themselves from you, even if they're right in front of you. I believe this is the advice also I would give to parents. Is at all times and in all relationships, try to feel what Divine Mother wants from you and to remain connected heart to heart, soul to soul with everybody you're talking to, whether it's a clerk in a store, whether it's your boss at work, whether it's your only son. It's hard to practice when you're so attached, so you have to practice when it's easier. And you learn these feelings, and you learn it because you go forward with a certain energy, and it feels a certain way, and it's disastrous. Swamiji said to me once after such an experience on my part, he looked at me so sweetly and he said, whenever your ego is involved, he said to me, you make terrible decisions. And it was exactly what happened. I could trace it all the way through. I could feel that point in which pride and all these other things had set in. I made all these decisions and it was a disaster. But I remembered. And the next time I was starting to go down that path, I could feel it. And when I tell somebody something because I really want them to know and I'm smart enough to say it, it feels a certain way. It's real different than when Divine Mother whispers to you, why don't you say this to me? And you just learn. And as I said, you have to have the courage to experiment. Swami Kriyananda, as many of you know, was separated from Self-Realization Fellowship in 1962. The event happened over a plan he had in Delhi to build a temple, and in America they didn't want it. All of this is in a book called A Place Called Ananda. It's not important, those details, that's not the point here. He told us this story for 20 years, many different times. Then one time he said, let me just think how to say it. I was there in Delhi, I wanted to build Master's work. I didn't feel any specific guidance about what to do, but building a temple seemed like a good idea. So I thought I would see what happened if I put my will behind something without feeling that specific guidance. And it turned out to be one of the biggest disasters in a sense of his life, although it was really good news for us because Ananda Sangha came out of it. But what I heard from that is, wow, what courage. You know, he just wanted to know. And so he decided to experiment. And if we really want to know, we have to have the courage to try. And the detachment to say, well, that one didn't work very well, did it? Let me make a note the next time. But instead, we hold ourselves in. And Swamiji said, we don't learn anything from suppression. All it is whatever we've suppressed just hangs out there in the dark and just confuses us. And then some other time, it usually kind of burrows over here and then shoots out over here, and we don't even know what we're upset about at that point. It's far better to just do our best, face the consequences, learn from the mess if it's a mess, notice the victory if it is, and then go forward. With each other, there's no other way to do it. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts?
Good morning. How to tackle with misunderstanding with your near and dear ones in their relations with you?
The question is what to do about misunderstandings?
Yeah, it's related to that.
Well, we suffer. The first thing that we do is suffer. First thing that we have to do is suffer. Suffering, alas, is a very good teacher. So we also have to accept the fact that we're not going to progress through this life without tears and troubles, because we tend not to get the point until things get painful. Master said he has a disagreement with Divine Mother about the way she teaches us through suffering. And I've always been so touched by that, his tender heart. He would like it if Divine Mother didn't make us suffer before we were able to learn. But almost always, if we're not being pricked in some way, we just go along just the way we always were. So I think when misunderstandings come, the first thing to ask is not what did so-and-so do to me, but what can I learn from this? What is this showing me about the aberration, the likes and dislikes of my heart? How can I be more sensitive to other people's realities? Now, I must add, and I never said this, and it really needs to be said, not everybody wants to change or is capable of changing. So to imagine, even for a moment, that if you just get your attitude together, everybody around you is just going to fall into line. That's just not true. Many times we go through whole incarnations, and the only thing we can ever balance is our inner reality. But then we have to come to this point, which is God sends us everything for our well-being. In the Holy Science, Sri Teshwar defines tapasya as patience, which is just the patient endurance of whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. I think when we have misunderstandings with people, we should meditate deeply, we should hold the question to the light, we should tune into their superconscious reality, we should see if we can find anywhere in creation a creative, positive response. We should make an effort for that creative, positive response. We should try to learn whatever it is that is being reflected back to us about our controlling nature, our lack of sensitivity. But we also have to be appropriate. Sometimes people are terrible, and they're our own family. And they just want something from us that we cannot give them. Or they want us to be a way that we can't be. I remember saying, my husband and I have a very nice relationship, but I'm not much of a homemaker. And we were somewhere, and this woman had made her house really beautiful, and she was such a nice homemaker. And I sort of looked to him and said, gosh, it would be nice if you had a wife like that. Too bad you don't. You know, it's like, what can I do? This is who we are. So at a certain point, people are asking things of you that even if you wanted to, you can't give them. And then the challenge is to just to your own equanimity. This is the Kshatriya place between the eternal and the ephemeral. There's another factor here, which is, Swamiji says, we suffer in the way we have inflicted suffering. So if we find ourselves partnered with a wife or in-laws or children, this couple in our community was having a lot of trouble with their son. And they came to Swamiji complaining about him. And I think just to test them, Swamiji said, you know, sometimes parents have to understand that they just got, do you have this expression in India? A lemon, meaning you just got a sour one that's not going to work. So all of a sudden, you know, they're coming about the problem with their only son, and he says, except that you have a lemon like this. And they were just horrified. But I think it kind of snapped their minds a little bit, which is just because he's our son doesn't mean he's going to be all these things. And then Swami said very sweetly, but I don't think so, like that. But sometimes we have the karma to just be in situations that will never resolve well. And we have to then do tapasya. And we don't do tapasya like, look at me enduring you. It's like we do the tapasya to say, let me just expand my patience, let me expand my understanding, let me detach myself from the expectation that you are there to make me happy. It's very interesting. Rajarsi Janakananda, who was Master's most advanced male disciple, was married, and his wife was mentally unbalanced. And she fiercely and intensely disliked his spiritual life and constantly did his best to interfere with it. And this man was self-realized, became self-realized. But you read in Autobiography of a Yogi, or in various things that you see, how Rajarsi had to arrange things to be able to come to Mount Washington and see Master because his wife was so fiercely opposed to it. And Master just said sweetly, oh, you got that wife to teach you patience, right? So sometimes we just have to smile a little bit. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, there's a story of a man who had a real shrew for a wife. And he smiled at Master and said, but I have gone somewhere and she doesn't know where I am. Meaning I have just gone into the spirit now. So we're paying a debt, we're learning a lesson, we're getting to do tapasya, but also you have to really ask, you know, what is being reflected at me that I can change? And after I've done everything I think I can do, then we have to simply go in another angle. Master made the chilling remark that families are drawn together not only because they love each other, but also because they hate each other. And he said, and you get to fight it out at close quarters. We have this sentimental idea that because these are my people, that somehow we should like each other. But sometimes yes, sometimes no. You know, and it's just one chapter in a very long story. Okay. So, okay, we'll take one more.
Asha, how can we make it easier to forgive someone?
To focus.
To forgive someone, how can we make it easier for ourselves?
Well, I don't know how to make it easier, but let's talk about making it possible. Actually, there's a few letters about forgiveness in this book, Ask Asha. I had an experience in my life where I felt someone had done a very bad thing to me several bad things to me over a long period of time. When I finally got my head above water, a lot of experiences began to focus down into just a few. And I was very, very upset about these experiences. And I began to ask myself, why have I focused on just these things? And I realized in every case, I knew better and allowed someone else's thinking to dominate my own sense of my inner reality. And I realized that my fury was not at the other person. It was at my lack of courage for being able to stand up to truth as I understood it. Now, that's only one part of it, but every uncomfortableness that we have inside of us is always about us. The only reason that that person can upset our equanimity is because it resonates somewhere. And one of the things that we have is that people are there to conform to my ideas. And the whole idea of forgiveness, Swamiji, he talked about it sometimes, but he never liked it very much. It's awfully, I forgive you. You know, here I am the righteous, noble one, and you, crummy rat that you are, you know, I forgive you. So there's a kind of perhaps not so helpful attitude, even in the word. I like better to come to peace with what has happened. And in the particular case of my own, where I was so upset, and then I realized I was mad at myself, okay, so I'm not blaming the other person, now I'm mad at me, which is better, but not good, for being such a chump or a fool or whatever you might want to say. But one of the things that Swamiji has taught us by his I understand why you feel that way is that in the moment, it always seems like a good idea. Because if we had a better idea, we would follow that. Sometimes we do it because we're frightened, because we don't know what the consequences will be, because we want to keep the peace, because we're just completely blind and had no idea what was going on. But still, with the understanding we had, we did the best we could. Now, when we begin to really see ourselves in that light, then it suddenly becomes obvious, no matter what they did, they obviously did the best they could with the understanding they had. Talking about raising children, when your child is 4, you don't get really angry at him because he cannot take his college entrance exam. You stupid child, you should be able to take your college entrance exam. Because he can't, he's 4. So you look at your wife, your husband, your in-laws, your boss, you should have been different. But if he could have been different, he would have been different. That is precisely and exactly the understanding that they have. There's nothing to forgive. How can you forgive your child for being 4? You simply accept and you come to peace with the fact that this is what the reality is. And so I would ask myself, why can't I come to peace with this? What am I afraid of? What am I holding on to? What unrealistic expectation do I have? And the prayer is not so much, how can I forgive him, but what am I afraid of? And often fear is the big answer. I've had marvelous results when I pray. What am I afraid of? What am I holding on to? And then a whole new story unfolds that isn't about someone else. It's only about me. All right, a very important and good question. I'm going to say, because we have reached the end of our time, I'll tell you one short story just for fun. In the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, the Apostle Paul was apparently a very, very talkative man. And this is in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. And he gave a program someplace where he was lecturing, and it was on the second floor of a building. And it was a very hot night, and all the windows were open. And it was very crowded, and everybody was sitting on the windowsills. But apparently, even in the Bible, it says, Paul was very long-winded, and he talked, and he talked, and he talked. And hours went by, and it got later and later. And one poor man sitting in the window listening fell asleep, fell out of the window, 2 stories, hit the ground, and died. That Paul had actually talked him to death. So Paul went out and resurrected him from death. I'm not making this up. This is in the Bible. So my principle is, end when you promised, because only risk talking them to death if you can resurrect them, which I can't, so that's the end of the evening. Okay.